Sometimes it's like I'm watching myself. Like I'm outside.
Ka hoihoi ngā reo. E tauronarona ana.
The challenges I face. The decisions I make. Should I?
Me pērā.
I want to be.
They want me to be.
I pretend
to be.
But if I listen harder,
Ka rongo.
I hear myself. Navigating the DMs. The conversations with my kaiako.
Te tautoko mai a taku whānau.
It's connected.
And I can take a breath.
And then I'm inside. Standing, feet firm on the ground.
Me he pou.
Strong. Proud. Grounded.
Te mahoi.
From here I can go anywhere. Find my own path.
Toku tuakiritanga.
Whatever comes,
I know myself.
I am ready.
Awesome. Tēnā tātou. Nau mai haere mai to this tūturu webinar on this Thursday afternoon. Ko taupiri te maunga, ko Waikato te awa, ko tainui te waka, ko Waikato te iwi, ko Ngāti Mauta te hapu no Ngārua wahia ahau, ko Tūmokai Morgan tōku ingoa. Kia ora everybody, my name's Tūmokai. I am the Tūturu Operations Manager based out of the New Zealand Drug Foundation and am one of the wider Tūturu team. My primary focus revolves around supporting and coordinating the network of Tūturu providers around implementation and general troubleshooting. Summary of this webinar for those coming from our previous and for those who are brand new to this one. This is the third webinar that Tūturu has run in recent months, following on from a two-part vaping series where we explored the data from ASH's Year 10 survey facilitated by Ben Uden, the Director of ASH, as well as an in-depth discussion from our Tūturu team around practical, ready-to-implement solutions that schools can employ to respond to youth vaping. And I'd encourage you, if you haven't watched those, head over to the website at tuturu.org.nz under Tūturu in Action to go and jump into those. Both of them are an hour each, well worth the watch. Before we get stuck into some of this content, just a bit of a recap around Tūturu, just an overview. What is it? Tūturu is a national kaupapa that supports schools in developing robust and evidence-based approaches to well-being. As we all know, schools are ecosystems of learning and support that can help all students achieve and get support quickly and easily. And you might ask yourself, how does Tūturu go about doing that? And it helps by aligning what students experience in the school environment that helps them to develop the critical thinking skills students learn through the resources we produce, how students are supported at school when issues arise, how professional services provide additional support to schools, how the wider community of school whānau and services help students lead healthy, successful lives, all culminating and working together in new ways to create solutions for the gap between schools and health services. Moving on to today's focus around anxiety, following on from our previous two-part vape webinar series, we polled our audience around what was a topic or topics that they were interested in exploring in a follow-up series. And the highest hit rate for that one was anxiety. And as we know, at this time of the year, there feels like, or there is this heightened sense of anxiety in the school environment, with end-of-year wrap-up and exams and study leave coming in, and all of the ebbs and flows that come within the school space at the end of the year. Similar to our first two-part series, we'll be following on the same approach with this one, two-part series, this one focusing on the topic with our colleague here, Scott Turnball, who we'll introduce shortly, and that second part focusing on with the Tūturu team support, taking us through strategies and plans for helping young people deal with anxiety and other issues at school. Some of the values that Tūturu really aims to embody is partnering with experts and fostering a network of support. And I think that links in quite nicely with where our presenter for today's webinar, Scott, comes in quite nicely. So Scott Turnball, he's a DAPANS registered addiction practitioner and accredited clinical supervisor, currently working at Aroha ki te Tamariki Trust in the Mirror HQ team based in Otepoti, Dunedin. Scott supports young people aged 12 to 25 with their substance use and other coexisting issues, while also offering support to their whānau system. His previous clinical experience has been working as a counsellor and what was previously known as District Health Board, Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services, and coordinating supported accommodation housing for adults seeking addiction support. And you might be wondering, where's the link here between Tuturu and Scott? And really going in a bit of a backstory there, Scott, with our wider Tuturu network of providers, has worked alongside our network in Otepoti. He's been part of their annual whole school approach days, which are opportunities where schools and other services come together for training around alcohol and other drugs and well-being. It's also a great opportunity for school staff to connect with each other and with services in their region to discuss relevant issues and responses. There is a write-up on the Tuturu website that outlines a bit about what that day involved and what were some of the topics they explored. So moving into an overview of what we can look forward to this afternoon. In this presentation, Scott will be providing an overview of anxiety, including what it is, its impacts, some of the signs and symptoms that typically present in young people. He'll also be breaking down generalized and social anxiety and how each may impact young people's behavior, thoughts, and physical sensations. His presentation will also explore common coping strategies people experience regarding anxiety use, and briefly touching on how social media impacts that. I know that that was a point from our last webinars that came through in the questions, and all culminating and wrapping up with what you can do to help someone experiencing anxiety. There will be an opportunity at the end of this presentation to ask questions, and with that, I will pass it over to Scott. Kia ora, Scott. Thank you very much.
Kia ora tūmakai. Thanks a lot for inviting me along to this. It's a brand new kind of frontier for me to be presenting in the web format, but we'll give it a go. Yeah, this presentation here is titled Anxiety in Young People, How to Help. Kia ora to the Tuturu team for helping me shape that up. And I guess I should also greet everyone else out there watching. Kia ora. It's odd for me not to be able to see you face to face, but I hope you find this engaging enough to meet your needs. I'll just go into a little bit of a kōrero moment here around hoping to build some whakawhanaungatanga and connect with you, but also to help kind of show how I landed in this spot where I've had a lot of experiences of working with people with anxiety. In the top left picture there is Tokanui Hospital in the Waikato. I was lucky enough to live out there in that settlement during my primary school years. And so I got exposure kind of firsthand to a large mental health facility. And what I've realized is that it kind of normalized mental health experiences for me growing up. Next to that, we've got Te Awamutu College, which is where I went to school. It's also where I probably experienced the most anxiety myself in my life. So that's the first-hand kind of learning ground there. Going down here, we have Kirikiriroa, where I started working, as Tūmakai mentioned, in those two different services and started getting my first experiences working clinically with people. And then now we move over to Otepoti, Dunedin, that nice shot of the harbour down here and the bit of the city. I've been down here since 2017 working at Whakaata Tohu Mirror HQ team, like Tūmakai said, working clinically with people who present with alcohol and drug problems, but a lot of the time anxiety is part of that picture. So it's really a kind of almost daily conversation I'm having with people. If we move on to the hopes and aims of this presentation, I really hope that it increases understanding of what anxiety is and how it might affect people. Being aware, of course, that each individual will have their own experience, but hopefully we can get close enough to what the baseline might look like. I hope that we can increase empathy towards those who struggle with their experience of anxiety. And I hope that we can build recognition that you can make a positive difference for those who have difficulties with anxiety too. This statement here, I'd like you to kind of hold in mind through this presentation, and also just in general with anybody you meet and come face to face with, maybe with yourself too, that when a person feels safe, the body can let its guard down, allowing the mind and spirit of the person to flourish. This is where play happens, this is where growth occurs, and this is where the true nature of a person can be seen. And a lot of this presentation really, looking at anxiety, is talking about the ways in which anxiety blocks the true nature of the person to be seen. And hopefully we can create a space to allow that person to show up again by being someone who's seen as safe and someone who understands. In order to set the scene for this presentation, I'm going to move into a video from here. I really like this video. It was the basis of me forming this presentation when I first presented it. And I think it really covers a lot of the essence of anxiety. So we'll get that going now.
I spent a lot of time on my own, so I got used to it. I'd just be sat there on my computer, either playing video games or reading articles online. I became rather withdrawn. I had next to no friends. I started to gain almost a fear of people, I suppose.
I couldn't really speak to people properly. I didn't have any confidence. I couldn't articulate my thoughts very well. I was very quiet, paranoid about the people around me. And when we were playing team games, they'd pick me last. That was an awful experience. I felt like there was something very wrong with me, and I couldn't figure out what it was.
There's so much peer pressure. Oh, have you got this new bag or this new phone, or have you heard of this, or you've seen that? And obviously, I'm still not into half the things that normal teenagers are into today. So I felt that pressure of, I'm a complete outsider. Interacting with people was very difficult. I hadn't really had experience with just having a normal conversation with someone. I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do. I am constantly thinking, do they think I'm an idiot? Do they think I'm weird? Do they think I'm strange? All sorts of things.
When I moved to the grammar school, I found that I wasn't actually at the top. I was more towards the bottom. I wasn't as good as them. They were so much better than me. And it brought on a lot of anxiety. So I describe it like the reactions inside the sun, because it was so intense and I didn't know what it was. It was very scary. And I remember being with my friends. I just wanted to escape. I just wanted to walk out the room, detaching myself from the environment and everything going in slow motion, finding it hard to breathe sometimes. I was in my maths lesson and I was sitting in the middle of 2 or 3 people. I couldn't hear the things around me anymore. I could hear them, but I didn't feel like I could process anything. I was looking down at my paper and looking up and looking down again. It was like everything was just quite far away.
I think one of the worst times that I felt most anxious was in English class. So having to stand up and read this book felt so anxious, I just completely froze. And I just couldn't get the words out physically. Like they were on the end of my tongue, but they were stuck. So I stood there for about 2 minutes. So I just sat down, and for the next half an hour of that lesson, I was just stuck in my own head in that classroom. I physically felt sick. I felt like I was in a sauna as well. I started sweating. My heart was going 70,000 miles an hour. It physically hurt.
At first it started happening like maybe once every so often, and then it started increasing to once a week until I got to the point where it was happening every day. I was feeling like that all the time. Actually, a lot of people didn't believe me, or they thought I was just being a teenager. This is normal. It got worse after that, and I withdrew from my GCSEs and didn't do them due to like the severity of my mental health.
So I just had this overwhelming feeling of, I'm really alone right now. This is absolutely awful. And it all just built up and built up. It physically wound me up. I almost felt like a jack in the box sometimes. And how someone's slowly winding the handle, slowly, until I'm just going to pop.
And I thought that I don't really deserve to live because I felt stressed out when I just looked at the books. I feel like a terrible human being. And then I took an overdose. I got fast track into CAMS and then things started changing for the better. First I saw a key worker who I think did an assessment on me. And then I got to see a psychiatrist. And then for over the next few months, I got to see both of them. At first it was weekly, then it was once every 2 weeks, and then it was once every month or so. That actually helped a lot because I felt supported. I felt like I could talk about things. I felt like I could just letting things out, just a release of emotions. People were listening to me. I felt like I was allowed to be unwell. And it got me to a state where I could start doing things again, or could start making my own choices and helping myself get better.
It helped just to be able to talk to somebody. I could sit there and talk for the hour. I was just trying to explain to her how hard it was. I have very few friends. I feel like I'm near enough terrified of people, and it's incredibly hard. All the emotions and all the thoughts and everything were constantly whirling around. At some points it just felt near enough physically dizzy. While I was talking, those normal fears of being scared and being worried about people, I didn't feel any of that anymore. I could let all this out because there was someone that not only was there, but wanted to be there.
All right. I just want to kind of point out a thing that I'm really aware of with this style of presentation is that hopefully it's a resource you can come back to. So as I go through this, I might move kind of fast through certain aspects, or there might be parts of it that don't quite land straight away, but I hope that you can come back to this resource and look at it at your own pace, so that you can access the information in that way and kind of gain an understanding over time, not just in this hour. But what I hope to go through is kind of talking a little about what is anxiety, what might it look like, some common thoughts and behavior patterns that show up for people who really struggle with anxiety, some of the impacts that can happen for those people that are really getting derailed by anxiety, and then starting to talk about what can help. And what can help in your position as somebody, I'm kind of assuming here that I'm speaking most of the people in school environments, teachers and other staff who may not have training in this area. Maybe they do, but what can you do if you aren't professionally trained to help with anxiety that will make a difference? And then we'll wrap up with some questions. So what is anxiety? It's an emotion we all experience. It's a normal part of human life. Being anxious on its own isn't a bad thing. It can actually be helpful. It's characterized by feelings of tension, worried thoughts, physical changes, such as raised heartbeat, sweating, and an increased sensitivity to our surroundings. It's the activation of our survival response. An internal alarm is triggered that causes a spike in adrenaline, and we are preparing our body to take evasive action. You may have heard of the fight, flight, freeze response. This is what we're talking about. Anxiety really is the fuel for this response. It starts to trick our body into thinking that we're in life-threatening danger, that something seriously bad is going to happen. And this got instilled in us through our ancestors back in early times with things like living in the past where imminent danger was actually way more prevalent than it is now, such as predatory animals maybe coming into the cave or the village, severe weather events, floods and earthquakes and the like, and maybe other humans, who didn't have the best intentions and were not afraid to actually threaten our life. as part of their survival. So that gets all set up inside us and it's still there. It operates way quicker than our mind can operate, so it gets activated even if we don't want it to. And then we look at today's times, imminent danger is actually less prevalent, hopefully, but there is a lot to worry about. So we have information overload in general. Just the amount of information we can access is a lot. There's global crises such as the pandemic. We all know the impact that's had on people's stress levels. And then if we're looking at adolescent populations in particular, but also humans in general, there's peer acceptance and validation. But for adolescents, that's a real big need. And if that isn't being met, it can feel like death. And then there's expectations of others as well. What do our whānau expect us to do? How do they expect us to be living? What about our teachers? What about our friends? If some of the stuff's out of alignment, then that can cause a lot of anxiety and activate that fight, flight, freeze system, even though it's not necessarily a clear threat to our life. There's a few different types of anxiety if we're getting into clinical diagnoses. I'll cover generalized and social anxiety in some more depth here today, but there's also things such as separation anxiety or specific phobias, like maybe fear of flying in airplanes or fear of heights, etc. There's quite a lot of them. If you have an interest in that, go and do some exploration. But for the sake of brevity and targeting what you're most likely going to encounter, we'll go into generalized and social. So with generalized, it's a persistent and excessive anxiety and worry about activities or events, even ordinary events and activities. The worry is out of proportion to the actual circumstance. It's difficult to control and affects how you feel physically. It often occurs along with other anxiety disorders and depression, and it kind of is actually quite rare to see an anxiety disorder on its own. More often than not, there's some other factor going on. So it's worth keeping that in mind as well, that these things don't just happen in isolation often. Some of the things about generalized anxiety disorder to be aware of is that there's a general pattern of expecting the worst to happen, worrying excessively about everyday things, health, family, relationships, money, even when there's no signs of trouble. This is where it can become confusing for people, where they're like, why are you worrying so much? Why are you stressed out? Everything's fine. For the person experiencing it, they don't believe that. And sometimes they actually know it's irrational, which kind of makes them even more frustrated and just starting to get really critical. They can find it hard to relax, to enjoy quiet time can be difficult. They will try and avoid situations that make them anxious. They can be very irritable. They can have difficulty concentrating or focusing. They can easily get fatigued because when you're anxious, it's actually a lot of strain on the body. They can suffer from stomach problems, nausea, again, from the strain of the chronic kind of strain on the body in terms of having to put up with anxiety as a default mode. And they can suffer from poor sleep. Sleep issues are really common in people who struggle with anxiety. And that can range from having difficulty falling asleep to being able to stay asleep for very long. And there's a general need with anyone with any kind of anxiety disorder really, but especially generalized, especially social, where they need to know what's going to happen in the future. And they'll do their best to try and predict that, to try and create a map of what's going to happen so they can try and navigate that in the safest way possible. And as we know, that's near impossible. Unfortunately, life doesn't work like that. So it's a bit of a stuck position. If we go into social anxiety, it's kind of got the baseline flavors of generalized anxiety, but it's a bit more heightened than anything socially. So there's high levels of anxiety, fear, and avoidance of social situations. And these kind of stem from feelings of embarrassment, self-consciousness, or concern about being judged or viewed negatively by others. And so some examples of difficult situations for people with social anxiety troubles are going out in public in general, especially unfamiliar places. especially places that might have larger groups of people or even unfamiliar groups of people that are more unpredictable. They'll probably struggle to make phone calls, and they may even take a very long time to reply to messages or emails because they're so worried about how to respond. They probably won't respond until they find kind of what they think is the safest response that's going to cause the less trouble for them, or maybe for other people too. They'll probably find it really difficult to initiate conversations, so much more comfortable in a response position. It's a bit safer that way. And there can often be a thing where with people with social anxiety, they'll struggle to eat or drink in public because it's really uncomfortable to know that people are observing them. And maybe as I'm going through these kind of disorder types, you know, it might bring certain people you know to mind. And kind of, you've probably seen this play out in various forms and various intensities. The good old bell curve, I think, is just a really handy tool in general, but it kind of reinforces a point to hold in mind too, that as I was talking about earlier, we all experience anxiety. Some of us are going to be down this far left side here if this was how intense the anxiety is for us or how much of a problem it was. You know, some people might be lucky enough to very rarely get anxious at all. The people we're talking about a lot of the time with anxiety difficulties are down this other end, where their experience of anxiety is quite prevalent and quite intense. Most of us hopefully will be somewhere in the middle, where we'll experience anxiety at different times, but it's not our kind of default thing to be really derailed by it. And it can be helpful to think of different scenarios being different for different people too. So a common one at school, I guess, is getting up to give a speech. People will sit at different spaces on this curve as well in terms of how anxious that makes them. If I was to say in this presentation, later in the presentation, I'm going to randomly select a participant to come in for an interview with me. You know, I can think that that would evoke different levels of anxious response in people too, depending on your history, how you view yourself, and what that specific scenario means to you. And I guess I really want to talk to a comment I've heard when I've spoken to people about anxiety is kind of a thing like, doesn't everyone get anxious? They kind of need to just move on. You know, I manage my anxiety fine, why can't they? Or their friend can do it just fine, why can't they? And it's really remembering that no one person's experience of anxiety is the same as the other. And just because you feel one way in a situation doesn't mean they are. Just because they don't look like they might be anxious doesn't mean it's not true. I found this curve here as well, the Yerkes-Dodson law, which is also a bell curve, and that it really applies to how anxiety gets in the way for people. And if you think about arousal as stimulation levels or stress levels on the axis down the bottom there, and then performance on the other one, what we know is that there's kind of a sweet spot in terms of how anxious people can be to perform well, how stimulated they are. With people with anxiety problems, they're overstimulated, they're over-aroused, and their performance is really impacted most of the time. And this is how it kind of causes problems in people's lives. And I guess I really feel for you in a teaching position because you're dealing with a whole classroom of people who sit in different positions on this curve. So how do you be everything to everyone in terms of delivering what they need? So that's no easy task to tune into. But it might become a bit easier if you are just dealing with one person and taking some time to just be one-on-one. Let's go through a bit of a breakdown now around a kind of a non-clinical way to think about anxiety. These are kind of non-clinical labels that I've come up with in terms of base level anxiety, which is just the default level for people who struggle with anxiety. And again, I'm talking about the people at the higher end of the scale here. Then we talk about what happens when that anxiety level starts to rise up and what starts to happen when it starts to reach a peak at high level. And I'm going to talk about these in terms of like a CBT kind of triad of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and what might happen in each of those domains. So if we go to a base level and look at thinking, we'll find that anxious thinking is definitely present, never really goes away, but it's less invasive. If we think about it like a radio on in the background of the mind, it's at a very low level. The volume knob is not really being turned up. And actually you could look at this gauge over here as a volume knob of anxious thinking, and as the levels rise, the volume of those thoughts becomes louder and harder to ignore. And it's actually harder to pay attention to anything else as that increases. There's a lot of analyzing of self and others. It's kind of a default way of thinking, reviewing a lot of behavior, reviewing a lot of aspects of self and others all the time. Thinking a lot more than acting. So when you're talking about an anxious person, you would never say kind of, man, that person really needs to like think before they act and just kind of take a moment. I can guarantee you they've thought an endless amount about most actions they're taking. We'll go to physical sensations. Their breathing will be quite steady for whatever their baseline is. It might not be as steady as someone who doesn't struggle with anxiety, but for them it's as steady as it will probably get for now. There'll be a low level of body tension in general, and the heart rate will be nice and steady too. If you think about that video again earlier, it kind of did a really good job of describing a lot of the physical sensations that go on for people with anxiety. Behavior, they'll be attempting to blend in generally. Try not to let anyone know that they have anxiety, let alone pay too much attention to them. They'll be scanning the environment, consistently looking for threats, getting a read on the situation, trying to predict what's going to happen. And they'll be seeking places and people who provide comfort and reassurance. As the anxiety rises, the level of worry and the thinking and analysis of self and others kind of heightens too. We're starting to prepare that things might be going wrong. So we're getting, we're starting to think about potential threats a lot more. Self-criticism will probably increase too, where people will start to become very hard on themselves about getting more anxious and what they're doing. And the thoughts become louder and louder inside the mind. Physical sensations, the breath will maybe get a bit shallower. So kind of the rapider breathing become quicker in frequency. And some people may even start holding their breath a bit more. It's quite a fascinating thing for people sometimes to realize what's happening with their breath. Like some people won't even realize they're holding their breath just because they're kind of in it, managing it. Body tension will increase in various parts of the body. It's just kind of whatever your default is. For some people, it's their jaw. Some people, it's the shoulders, and so on. And body temperature will go up too. So this ties into people starting to get sweaty and overwhelmed and flustered, and the heart rate will go up. Behavior, so they'll be trying to hide this even more. It'll become even harder for them to interact with others, and they'll become hyper aware of threat. As it escalates to the high level, they will become more and more anxious in their thinking. It'll become louder and faster, quite overwhelming. They'll feel like they have less and less control over their thoughts, and they'll start to think something is seriously wrong. Sometimes in a panic situation, they'll start to believe they're actually going to die, which is quite terrifying. Physically, then this is where we start to see the fight, flight, freeze response kick in. Stomach pain can happen, headaches and tension can come in, and the heart's pounding, along with probably sweating as well. What they'll do is they'll try and escape the situation or avoid anything else that's going to keep this kind of danger going. They'll become even less effective with communication, and they may become irritable or upset as a way of dealing with it. Some common anxious thinking patterns to target into. These are kind of like cognitive distortions, you might call them. They don't only show up in anxiety, but are often a feature. One of the things that's common is mind reading, in terms of spending a lot of time imagining what others are thinking. such as, you know, the new kid in the class hasn't said hello to me yet. They probably think I'm weird, would be an example. Catastrophizing is predicting only negative outcomes for the future. Should or must statements, so inflexible rules about how things should be. For example, they might think my friends should know I needed them today, and they didn't reach out to me. I must have the trendy shoes that are like the in thing to wear to non-uniform day, or else I'm going to be judged. And you can see how this is kind of hard because sometimes that might be a reality. We go into personalization, and this is thinking that other people's behavior has something to do with you. For example, my boyfriend is very quiet today. I must have done something to upset him. We can go into perfectionism, believing all mistakes are bad and need to be avoided. And then we can go into black and white thinking, seeing things as good or bad, no in between, no gray areas. So some common anxious behavior patterns we might see is cancelling plans at the last minute. Someone might have every intention to come to a party, to go to an event. They might even get so far as being in a car outside and just then driving home. Or they might just be crippled in bed and not even get close to going. But you can guarantee they've thought a lot about it and weighed it up. They can be slow to reply or call back. They can replay conversations over and over and over in their mind. This often will happen when they're on their own, perhaps in bed before going to sleep, which is why people can struggle to fall asleep. Especially important conversations, like people they're close with or people they'd like to be close with. They might rehearse conversations for the next day, so go through full-on script development around how to handle any potential, which is just such a draining exercise and can never go that way, but people still do it, and it can create a lot of anxiety. They might downplay their talents and abilities, because it's hard if people are paying attention. They'll know they won't perform as good as they can. Plus, they don't really want to have a spotlight shone on them. And they won't probably speak up very often when it matters. Again, if you speak up, people are going to be looking at you or listening. And they'll probably hide their true self in social settings, not feeling safe enough to be vulnerable, staying quiet, or putting on a kind of persona that is a bit of a shield to being hurt, showing who they really are. This can lead to avoidance, which is the main coping strategy of anxiety, is to don't engage any situation that could be anxiety provoking and to get out of there. It's really good for reducing anxiety, but it's really bad for keeping anxiety be a problem in the long term. So it's one of those classic kind of short-term great, long-term not so good situations. They want to make the anxiety end as quick as possible, so take whatever path works for that. They might distract with other stimulus, like going on their phone, listening to music, anything that can take their mind off whatever's stressing them out. And they might also employ some defense mechanisms through their projection, displacement, and rationalization. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go into those, but feel free to come back to them or look them up. Some of the impacts of anxiety here. If you think about performance being so impaired, they're not going to meet their needs or goals. Relationships get impacted negatively. Can lead to low mood and suicidal thinking, as illustrated in that video. Can cause physical health concerns based on the level of physical stress. And it can result in destructive coping behavior, such as drinking, using other drugs, isolating, just spending all their time in their own space, which is a safe haven, doing whatever they like doing. Maybe lashing out due to high stress. Maybe getting into relationships that are unhealthy because that's where they at least feel accepted and kind of it's a consistent, familiar space. Or they may become really good at people pleasing, just kind of doing what others want in order to maintain a less anxious kind of judgmental space or something like that. This is often where we start to meet people in our service, as a few of these things are happening, and so they're kind of referred to people who can help out with that a bit more. it'd be nice. I guess my hope is to try and help people curve that away, so we're dealing with the anxiety a bit sooner. I'll touch briefly on this. It could be a whole other presentation, but social media really drives anxiety in unhelpful ways for people, even people without anxiety disorders, but for people with anxiety disorders, it's worse. Peer validation is everything, and so it's just a network of your peers kind of accessible to you so easily. You're just going to be feeding that in whatever way your default is. Just promotes comparison to others, and if you're an anxious person, you're probably going to put yourself in a lower position than others. And then you have people only showing certain parts of themselves. It's a false kind of thing to compare to. There's certain rules on how to engage in social media, where something needs enough likes to kind of stay up or something like that. What happens if you don't tag a certain person in a post? Then we're just looking at information overload in general too. So many inputs. It's kind of like, yeah, a bit of a problem in this kind of technology boom era, is just how much input we have and what that means for our minds and our spirits, our mood. And social media is fast moving too. A bit like me as I try to get this presentation done. I notice I'm speeding up. It's just the kind of pressure demands, I guess, of society can really cause people to be in a position that isn't helpful if you're prone to anxiety. I'll move on. I really want to highlight and go slowly in this section here. I was kind of rushing a little bit to get to this part, so I really want to highlight what you can do to help. And as someone who may not be trained as a therapist or in the health field, you can make a massive difference. It's, I'm going to start with this first slide, which is about the way you are. Taking a breath is important. It's just what I did then. Kind of tune in. Being okay to go slowly. It's important to know that anxious people are often paying attention to how you are. If there is an anxious person in your classroom, they will have a read on everyone in the room. They'll be building up a bit of an index around how people behave in general. As a teacher or as an adult, you'll have, like, I guess, more of a prime position because you're kind of more visible more often. But also with their mates and classmates or enemies, they'll be kind of creating a list of who's safe and who isn't, and who's going to respond how. So you're basically on watch anytime you're in front of someone who's anxious, and they'll be really scanning your behavior and your attitudes and how you are to see if you're safe or not. Basically asking, can I let my guard down around this person? So that's really the essence of what I mean by the way you are, is not only in like very focused kind of interactions with someone, but just in general, trying to embody a position that an anxious person could feel safer in. If you do happen to have an interaction with somebody, let people know that they are seen and accepted is massive. In the video, the guy talks about that in terms of his experience of therapy, just having a space to be as they are. Go slow, create space for people. Validate their experience and feelings. It's really horrific for someone with anxiety to be brave enough to say they're feeling anxious and then be shot down with some kind of message that's like, I don't really believe you, or surely not, or it's not that bad. That's massive. Like, they might not come up in that way again for a long time if they have a brief experience like that. So to really validate that, look, I really hear you're feeling anxious right now. I really get it. You're really going through it. And I accept that to be the case. That goes a long way. Do not label them. You don't have to call them anxious. You don't have to say, oh, this sounds like you're fitting into social anxiety, as I saw on this webinar. That's not really helpful. Just use their own words. Don't judge whatever it is. Just listen, really. Listen a lot. Get it right, and show them that you understand what they're going through. Moving on to practical things that you can do. I'll kind of preface this by saying this is less important than the previous slide. These help, but your general attitude in terms of how you're approaching someone with anxiety will make the most difference. And what I hope is that if you kind of reflect back on a lot of this presentation, I spent a lot of time trying to get across what it's like for the person with anxiety, so that you have like an idea of kind of what they're probably experiencing without them having to explain it to you. But if they do feel comfortable explaining it to you, that's a real bonus. That's a gift. They really feel like you're someone who's worth at least testing out in terms of trust. But some of the practical things that you could do is to try and reduce avoidance. People with anxiety will try and get out of things a lot. It's actually not helpful for them. What you can do is try and work with them to see, is there another way we can do this? Maybe it doesn't have to be right now. Maybe it doesn't have to be in this format. But let's figure out together how we can face the situation without rescuing them. That's the next point. Don't do too much for them. You don't want to rob them of their experience of actually stepping into an anxious space and performing better than they thought they could, mostly on their own steam. That's huge. But what you can do is help set up the environment for them to have that experience and be creative with it. You know, it can mean a lot. You can assist with connecting to others. So maybe it's not you who has the techniques in terms of therapeutic techniques. Maybe it's not you who's the best person to even listen to them in the way they need it. How can you connect them to someone who can? I really want to highlight that one interaction can make all the difference as well. I can think back to my own schooling and a moment that sticks with me in terms of a teacher dealing with one of my friends vomiting in class. And all of me and my friends were quite anxious and geeky, so that caused a lot of anxiety potential for us, and that teacher handled it so well. They kind of didn't overreact, addressed it, connected in with the person to make sure they're okay, took control. And this was all just like, you know, a 5-minute decision to kind of pause their plan and deal with it and not get into any attitude of judgment. You know, it really sticks with me, like still, and it'll be the same for people you're encountering in the school environment. Here are a few links that you can go check out. One is this website that has some self-help resources. One is an information page on anxiety. One is a YouTube video about box breathing, which is a type of breathing that might help someone regulate themselves when they're anxious. And it's just good for them to practice in general, probably all of us actually. And another one is a CBT website that has free courses with targeted courses on generalized and social anxiety. So I've reached the end here of the presentation, and thanks for listening. We'll go back to some questions.
Awesome. Kia ora, Scott, for running us through that. I was reflecting as we went through, as you're going through all of that, and what was coming out on mine was, I'm sure that that's something we can all relate to, whether it's deadlines for work, events that you have to go to, but maybe are not too keen to go to, but there may be an obligation there for our teachers that they're feeling around sorting leave out on short notice. So you're woken up the next day and then having to sort that out with what your class is doing the next day, as well as navigating peak hour traffic depending on where you live in the country. I know there's a flurry of emotions that that could bring up in people, especially now up here in Auckland. You drive anywhere during school hours, and it's a challenge, that's for sure. As we're going through, I can imagine the difficulties that this would create in general, but for our young people in processing what's around them. I remember in that video around just the focus, just honing in onto what was directly in front of them. That I think it was that line, "Thoughts become louder." And I don't know, like for our viewers around, if you ever had two people try and talk to you about two different things at the same time, and how difficult it can be to hone in on what's going on. Those pieces around the cognitive distortions, the perfectionism one in particular, mine, and the balancing between perfectionism and that desire to just do a good job, to do a really good job about something, and then obviously the balance and trying to fine tune that, because as you said, it's when everything, there can be no mistakes, there can be no negative scenarios around that, and then the flow on. And also, I guess, tying into maybe some of that wider social, societal sense here in Aotearoa around tall poppy, as you were going through those bits, tall poppy around, the downplay of talents and the balance between people who are just humble, or the humility aspect of what they're doing. Not speaking up in a group versus maybe people just agree with what's going on and they've stayed silent. Silence as agreement, or keeping a low profile is maybe wherever you're at is not something you want to be involved in. So you just want to go, no, thank you. I'm quite happy to carry on, and can imagine the complexity of navigating that. And that line that you mentioned, like the what helps slide around, one interaction can make all the difference. That pebble in the pond, that first domino that gets knocked over, and how important that message is. And of course, an acknowledgement to our teachers for having to be everything to everyone all the time. And that, in this, from 8 to 4, 9 to 3, the whole world is meant to be condensed down into the time that they got there. But yes, no, that was coming through really strong, and I can imagine that for our audience today, that really resonating for them, or like you'd mentioned, prompting examples in their own life or their professional life around that. Alrighty. I know I've got a few questions that are coming in on mind. We've got one here. All right, this is coming through from Kim. Do you think it would be useful for all staff in schools to have a broader understanding of anxiety in students?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. No question. The more you can understand anxiety, the more prepared you are to interact with somebody who is going through it, in any moment. You can kind of never be prepared for when you have to face, I guess, a tricky situation with a student. So the more, it's the kind of thing where the more aware we are, the better we are equipped to deal with that, or to be calm enough to be like, hey, I don't have the answers, but I know that it's helpful for me to remain calm, allow you the space to go through what you're going through, and let's help figure it out together, without necessarily feeling like they have to solve it.
Yeah, it's a really key point there, is around the teachers are going back to the being everything to everyone, and the balancing act between it. Also, when you've got it next to, well, it may be that you could be very much the person who's actually noticed that for the first time in that young person's day. But no, that's important. It's interesting. Following on from that, I was wondering, linking back to that common anxious behaviors slide. I see a lot of this in a number of students. When or what would tell me I need to support the student further, and maybe send them to see the nurse at school, or the school guidance counselor? I'm thinking that might be quite relevant for our teaching whānau.
Yeah, I think if you start to see these behaviors kind of show up more often than not, so if you're starting to see like, hey, look, you're understanding that everyone might have a rough day where they're feeling more anxious than usual. If you start to notice that this is a bit of a trend and it's starting to show up most days, it's worth kind of checking in and perhaps getting more help there, especially if it's clearly impacting their ability to do what they need to do in class, such as like complete their assignments, even show up to class, maybe to get on with their peers, or even just to like hold their mood together. It's once it starts to impact functioning, I guess, you start to see that as a clear sign. But I would kind of encourage people maybe to go a little bit earlier than that too, to check it out. Don't be afraid to be like, something in my intuition is kind of pinging off here that I need to check this out. Yeah, check it out with the person. Hey, you know, I just kind of want to check in how you're going, and really check yourself when you ask that question, so that you're kind of transmitting an opportunity for them to share if they're really going through it or whatever. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it's around just that question around the are you okay, and listening to your gut, because I can imagine that, you know, as people, there does seem to be this, you get this sixth sense around it when you know something's a bit off, and you may not be able to make sense of what is, but you know, I'm sure we've all had that experience of going, something's a bit different here. Maybe it might be worth exploring it with something as simple as, you know, hey, are you okay? Things are a little bit off today. No.
Yeah, and I'll just say it's worth it to ask that and to be wrong, and that everything's fine. You know, it's worth it for the chance that you might actually give someone an opportunity to recognize something, because you actually ask, remembering that anxious people are going to struggle probably to raise that themselves.
No, exactly. Yeah. And I'm thinking in relation to the point of understanding that young person's experience around building empathy with what's going on. I was thinking, say a scenario is if you've got a class that is highly stressed and anxious, how would I support them as a group? So, you know, moving out from that individual into that group setting where there's a general sense of unease that's going on.
Yeah. I really like that video you guys had at the start. You know, it's great. And one thing that really stood out on there, and which I wrote down, was, you know, if I listen hard enough, I can hear myself and possibilities open, and I can breathe. And it's the same thing in terms of what you can do as a staff member. Is if you can do that for the young person, you know, you're co-regulating them. You're helping them achieve that themselves. It's massive. It's like, it's a really powerful statement. It really stood out, and it's really relative to the experience of anxiety. And so if you can really listen to people in your classroom as a default way that you are, you're going to be more tuned into this stuff, and you're going to help people step into that space where they can thrive.
No, yeah, can really see the benefits of some of those techniques and strategies, not just in relation to this, but into the wider setting. Like you said, going in, it's just like, I've just taken a breath to center me there, get me back in. I can remember times, was never a fan of doing presentations at school myself, and having to stamp down on a slightly wobbly leg just to keep it quiet, so that you wouldn't, you know, to try and get your start sorted. So yeah, really important. I was thinking around that, because we are you know, are aware that with our teachers that in most cases, they've probably got a very short window of time where they're with their class with multiple students in it, and having to navigate all of those different life experiences. The time, I was just wondering, and going back to the bell curve here, what's your feeling around that cool down phase? Obviously, there will be a peak when it comes to those anxious feelings. What does the cool down phase look like? What can that look like? You know, the evening out of the bell curve, and how long could this go for? Because I can imagine that sometimes time may be a factor in terms of teachers engaging with it, or maybe they have a double period, and maybe there may be some more time to balance that. What's your thoughts?
So if you're talking about like how long it might take for that person to start to regulate, is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah. I would say that, like, starting with like 3 minutes, you know, that could be enough for somebody. 3 to 5 minutes could be enough actually to cause a noticeable improvement for someone. And so that could mean even just, you know, like the example I gave with that teacher, I remember, like, there was like 5 minutes, I think, where class was kind of paused and the situation was addressed in a way that was really respectful. We lost 5 minutes of lesson time, but, you know, that's almost a more important lesson in terms of helping that person through it, and even me who wasn't directly in it, you know. I think if you go anywhere up to an hour as well, it could take. Like, I think, you know, trusting that it's not going to be just because I say 5 minutes will help a lot of people. Some people, they'll need more. So maybe it's not you kind of being there with them for that hour, but can you take 5 minutes to get them to a space where they can be for an hour, kind of, and trust that that's actually the most important thing for them to do. Like, it'll go a long way that you actually trusted them. If it's someone who's genuinely anxious, they will appreciate it so much, and they'll be working really hard to try and get out of that. It'll become clear if it's someone who's just having a joke, you know, that'll become clear in time. So, yeah, please don't assume they're just having a laugh. Yeah, kind of, it'll be so valuable to the people who need it if you can get them somewhere.
The naive inquirer, ask the question even if it may not result in anything. Well, I am mindful of our time and appreciate not only the presentation, but the ongoing relationship that's been built between yourself and our wider Tūturu whānau down in Ōtepoti, and can imagine that there's a lot of relevance to the topic discussed this afternoon, not only in relation to our young people, but in terms of people's personal lives and professional lives that maybe are not quite focused, outside of the classroom. So to speak. With that, everyone, our viewers here, just a wee nod to the part 2 that will be following up this webinar next Thursday, same time, same place, as the Tūturu team take us through strategies and plans for helping young people deal with anxiety and other issues at school, and hopefully introduce some simple, effective and evidence-based interventions that can support student well-being. With that being said, again, thank you very much, Scott, for your time and also for being able to give us some of that insight and that knowledge that you hold in this space. And I'm sure that our viewers found it useful and beneficial for them in their practice. And with that, everyone, appreciate your time and energy coming in. I know Thursday afternoon can be a tricky time to sit down and try and absorb some learning. So I appreciate you guys spending the time, taking it out of your day to be with us here today. So until next time, we'll catch you at the part 2 of anxiety webinars next Thursday, same time, same place. Ka kite anō.